"I'll see you again soon, Mr. Carlisle." Those chilling words from a humiliated waitress would haunt a billionaire CEO before the most devastating power reversal in business history exposed his greatest nightmare. The woman he destroyed was actually his boss. When Danielle Porter endured public firing and racial humiliation while serving tables, nobody knew she was fulfilling a dying mother's promise to dismantle the very system that had crushed their family 25 years earlier. What drives a brilliant woman to scrub floors and endure cruelty in silence? And how does a 7-year-old's vow at her mother's bedside become the blueprint for corporate justice that spans decades? Watch as hidden recordings capture systematic discrimination, as 18 months of undercover investigation culminate in a boardroom confrontation that transforms victim into victor, and as one woman's strategic patience delivers the kind of poetic justice that restores faith in the universe itself. This is the story of how authentic power moves in absolute silence until the moment truth walks into the room and changes everything forever. Stay until the end to witness the most emotionally satisfying transformation ever captured, because sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who never forgot where they came from.
You people never know your place. Those 6 words, dripping with corporate arrogance and racial contempt, would echo through a luxury boardroom before the most shocking power reversal in business history proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in any company is the one everyone assumes works for minimum wage. The 42nd floor of Carlisle Heights Hotel commanded a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the kind of luxury that most people only glimpsed in movies or Instagram posts. The rooftop restaurant, Azure, represented the pinnacle of fine dining exclusivity, a space where corporate titans closed billion-dollar deals over $1,000 bottles of wine, while being served by staff who remained as invisible as the economic inequality that made such extravagance possible. Danielle Porter moved through this rarefied atmosphere with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to navigate hostile environments while maintaining her dignity, her standard black server's uniform marking her as part of the restaurant's carefully orchestrated theater of wealth and service. At 32, she possessed a natural elegance that transcended her modest work attire. But in a world designed to notice money over merit, her presence was treated as functional background to the real business of power and privilege. The evening shift at Azure was always the most demanding, when high-stakes corporate dinners required flawless service and absolute discretion from staff who were expected to anticipate needs while remaining essentially invisible. Tonight carried particular tension because word had spread through the kitchen that someone important was coming, an executive gathering that would determine the futures of employees who depended on these jobs to pay rent in a city where service workers were priced out of the very neighborhoods they helped maintain. Danielle's colleagues moved with nervous energy, their whispered conversations revealing the particular anxiety that comes from working in spaces where your livelihood depends on the satisfaction of people who have never learned your name despite seeing your face every day for months. But their treatment of Danielle revealed something uglier than professional stress. It exposed the casual cruelty that often exists between people who should be allies, but have instead absorbed the hierarchies designed to keep them divided. "Probably another diversity hire," muttered James, a white server whose mediocre performance was protected by assumptions about who belonged in premium service positions. His comment drew knowing smirks from colleagues who had never questioned why their workplace looked the way it did, who had accepted that certain faces were expected in certain roles without examining the systems that made such patterns seem natural. Maria, the assistant manager, rolled her eyes as she watched Danielle efficiently set up her station. "I swear they just hire them to check boxes these days," she whispered to another server, her voice carrying the particular resentment of someone who had convinced herself that other people's opportunities threatened her own security.
But Danielle simply absorbed these comments with the patience of someone who had heard variations of the same prejudices her entire career. Her composed response suggested either remarkable self-control or something deeper, the quiet confidence of someone who understood things about power that their tormentors couldn't imagine. There was something in her eyes, a sharpness that didn't match the humble deference her job required, an intelligence that seemed too large for the role she was playing. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed as they whispered their casual cruelties and made their assumptions about affirmative action and diversity quotas, was that they were dismissing someone whose actual relationship to their workplace would soon redefine everything they thought they understood about who had power and who was merely pretending to have it. If you've ever been underestimated because of your job title or dismissed because people couldn't see past their assumptions about who you're supposed to be, hit that like button right now. Share your own story of being judged by your circumstances rather than your capabilities, and subscribe to this channel because what happens next will prove that the most powerful people in any room are often the ones everyone assumes have no power at all.
Right at that moment, as Danielle's colleagues whispered their casual cruelties while preparing for the evening's important gathering, the universe was orchestrating the perfect entrance for someone whose arrogance would soon collide catastrophically with power he didn't know existed. What walked through Azure's doors next would prove that the most dangerous mistakes are made by people who confuse loudness with authority and prejudice with insight. Richard Carlisle burst through the restaurant's mahogany doors at exactly 6:30 p.m. with the theatrical swagger of someone who had spent decades mistaking inherited wealth for personal achievement. At 54, he carried himself with the particular brand of entitlement that comes from never having been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. His perfectly tailored Armani suit and platinum Rolex serving as armor against a world that might otherwise force him to confront his own mediocrity. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted immediately upon his arrival, staff members straightening their postures and adjusting their expressions with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to read powerful men's moods for their own survival. Richard fed off this deference like oxygen, his pale blue eyes scanning the dining room with the predatory attention of someone conducting an inspection rather than simply arriving for dinner. "Where's the manager?" he barked, his voice cutting through the refined ambiance that Azure's designers had spent millions creating. "I want to inspect this place before my board arrives. Can't have any embarrassments during tonight's presentation." Carla, the evening manager, materialized with the nervous energy of someone whose career depended on satisfying difficult personalities. "Of course, Mr. Carlisle. Everything is prepared exactly to your specifications. The private dining room is ready, the wine selection has been curated, and our best servers have been assigned to your event." But Richard's attention had already moved past her reassurances, his gaze fixing on Danielle as she arranged place settings at a nearby table. Something about her presence seemed to offend him on a visceral level. Perhaps her quiet confidence, perhaps her natural grace, or perhaps simply the fact that she existed in a space he considered his exclusive domain. "Who hired her for this floor?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to ensure that everyone within earshot would witness whatever humiliation was about to unfold. The question carried layers of assumption and prejudice that transformed what should have been a routine staff inquiry into something far more sinister. Danielle looked up from her work, her expression remaining professionally pleasant even as she recognized the particular type of confrontation that was developing. "Good evening, Mr. Carlisle," she said politely, stepping forward with the trained courtesy that service workers perfect to navigate hostile interactions. "May I take your coat?" Richard's reaction was immediate and telling, his face contorting with the kind of disgust that reveals character more clearly than any background check. "You people never know your place," he sneered, his words carrying centuries of coded language wrapped in the veneer of corporate authority. "I want her gone before tonight's dinner. This is a high-level executive meeting, not some diversity showcase."
The silence that followed was deafening as every staff member in the vicinity processed what they had just witnessed. Richard had just publicly demanded the firing of an employee based purely on her race, using language that would have been grounds for federal civil rights violations if anyone had possessed the courage or power to hold him accountable. But what Richard Carlisle didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined as he stood there demanding the removal of someone he considered beneath his notice, was that he had just made the most expensive mistake of his entire career while providing perfect evidence for his own professional destruction.
No one expected what happened next, because sometimes the most powerful people respond to cruelty not with anger, but with the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly how the story will end. What Richard Carlisle orchestrated as public humiliation would become the foundation for his own spectacular downfall, recorded for posterity by the very woman he was attempting to destroy. The firing unfolded with the methodical cruelty of someone who had perfected the art of institutional humiliation, Richard positioning himself at the center of the dining room to ensure maximum visibility for what he clearly viewed as an educational demonstration about power and place. Staff members gathered like reluctant witnesses to an execution, their faces reflecting the uncomfortable recognition that they were watching something that crossed lines, even in a workplace where casual cruelty was normalized. "Look at her," Richard announced to the assembled staff, his voice carrying the theatrical authority of someone performing dominance rather than simply exercising it. Standing there like she belongs in a place like this. Probably thinks her little diversity job makes her untouchable. His laugh was sharp and calculated, designed to invite others to join his mockery while establishing his position as the arbiter of who deserved respect. Carla approached the scene with visible reluctance, her manager's training warring with her basic human decency as she realized she was being forced to participate in something that felt more like a public lynching than routine personnel management. "Mr. Carlisle, perhaps we could handle this privately." "No," Richard interrupted, his voice rising to ensure that everyone in the restaurant could hear his next words. "I want everyone to see what happens when people don't understand their limitations. Fire her, right now, in front of everyone." The demand hung in the air like a toxic cloud, transforming what should have been a routine workplace into a theater of systematic dehumanization. But Danielle's response revealed something that should have terrified Richard if he had possessed the intelligence to recognize it. She remained perfectly calm, her composure intact, even as she became the target of the most public humiliation possible. "I understand," she said simply, her voice carrying neither anger nor submission, but something far more dangerous: acceptance. She removed her apron with the deliberate care of someone performing a ritual rather than simply changing clothes, folding it neatly and placing it on the nearest table while maintaining eye contact with Richard throughout the process. "Thank you for this experience, Mr. Carlisle," Danielle continued, her words chosen with precision that suggested layers of meaning that Richard was too arrogant to detect. "I'll see you again soon." Richard's laughter was triumphant and ugly, the sound of someone who had never learned the difference between winning a moment and losing everything that mattered. "Not unless you're bussing tables at a truck stop, sweetheart. This is what happens when affirmative action meets reality." The assembled staff joined his laughter with the nervous energy of people who understood that their own job security depended on appearing to share their boss's prejudices. But one person remained conspicuously silent. Jessica, the young hostess who had been working at Azor for only 3 months, watched Danielle's composed exit with growing unease,
her instincts telling her that something about this entire interaction didn't add up. As Danielle walked toward the elevator with her head held high, Richard called out one final insult that he thought would cement his victory. "Security will make sure you never set foot in this building again." But Danielle's response, delivered without turning around, contained a promise that would soon redefine everything Richard thought he knew about power, ownership, and the dangerous game of humiliating people whose true identity you've never bothered to discover. We'll see about that, Mr. Carlisle.
Right at that moment, as Danielle's mysterious parting words echoed through Azure's dining room, Richard Carlisle should have recognized the dangerous confidence in her voice. But arrogance has a way of making powerful people deaf to warnings, and what unfolded 3 hours later would prove that the most catastrophic mistakes happen when people assume they know who has real power in any room. The executive board dinner began at precisely 9 p.m., with all the pageantry that Richard had orchestrated to showcase his leadership of Carlisle Global Holdings. The private dining room had been transformed into a corporate theater where crystal chandeliers cast warm light over a mahogany table that could seat 20 of the company's most influential investors, board members, and strategic partners. This wasn't just dinner. This was Richard's opportunity to solidify his position as the irreplaceable leader of a hospitality empire worth over $2 billion. Richard moved through the gathering with the satisfaction of someone who had spent the day eliminating problems and asserting control, his earlier humiliation of Danielle already forgotten in favor of more pressing concerns about quarterly projections and expansion strategies. He greeted each investor with practiced charm, his confidence bolstered by the successful demonstration of authority that he believed had strengthened his position among the staff. "Gentlemen, ladies," Richard announced as the last course was cleared, raising his wine glass with theatrical flourish, "tonight marks the beginning of Carlisle Global's most ambitious expansion in company history. Under my leadership, we've transformed this organization into the premier luxury hospitality brand in North America." The assembled board members nodded with polite attention, but their body language suggested something that Richard was too self-absorbed to notice. They were waiting for something or someone whose absence was more significant than anyone present. The lead investor, Margaret Chen, a formidable woman whose venture capital firm had built and destroyed more corporate empires than Richard could count, checked her watch with visible impatience. "Richard," she said, her voice cutting through his self-congratulatory monologue with surgical precision, "we'll need to postpone the formal presentation until our chairwoman arrives. As you know, all major strategic decisions require her approval." The word chairwoman hit Richard like ice water, his confidence faltering as he processed implications he had never been forced to consider. In all his years as CEO, he had operated under the comfortable assumption that the board answered to him, that his position at the top of the corporate hierarchy was secure and unquestioned. The idea that someone above him might actually exercise authority was foreign and terrifying. "I wasn't aware we were expecting anyone else," Richard stammered, his voice losing the authoritative tone that had carried him through decades of corporate meetings. "Perhaps we could proceed with the preliminary discussions while we wait." But Margaret's smile was enigmatic and slightly predatory, suggesting knowledge that Richard didn't possess and power dynamics he had never bothered to understand. "I don't think that would be appropriate. After all, she owns 63% of the company." The revelation hit the room like a bomb, sending shockwaves through Richard's carefully constructed worldview. For 5 years, he had believed himself to be the ultimate authority at Carlisle Global Holdings, making decisions about personnel, strategy, and company culture without ever questioning whether someone else might have different ideas about how the business should be run.
That's when the elevator doors opened with a soft chime that somehow managed to command more attention than Richard's entire evening of grandstanding. The first person to emerge was a security escort, followed by a woman whose transformation from 3 hours earlier was so complete that it took several seconds for anyone to recognize her. Danielle Porter stepped into the private dining room wearing a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of boardroom authority rather than service industry employment, her hair styled in a professional updo that framed a face radiating quiet confidence and unmistakable power. Diamond earrings caught the chandelier light, and her Louboutin heels clicked against the marble floor with the rhythm of someone who owned the ground she walked on. The silence that followed was deafening as every person in the room, investors, board members, and especially Richard Carlisle, processed the impossible reality that the woman who had been publicly fired and humiliated just hours earlier was walking into their executive gathering as if she belonged there more than any of them. Margaret Chen rose from her seat with respectful deference that would have been unthinkable directed toward a service worker. Chairwoman Porter, thank you for joining us. We were just about to begin the strategic planning session you requested. The words Chairwoman Porter echoed through the dining room like thunder, shattering every assumption that had been made about power, ownership, and the dangerous game of judging people by their apparent circumstances rather than their actual authority. Richard's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, disbelief, terror, and finally the dawning recognition that he had just publicly humiliated the majority owner of his own company while providing her with perfect evidence of his unfitness to lead. Danielle took her seat at the head of the table without acknowledging Richard's existence, her attention focused on the business documents that would determine the future of an empire he had thought belonged to him. If you've ever witnessed someone's arrogance collide with reality in the most spectacular way possible, hit that like button right now. Share your thoughts on what Richard deserves for his treatment of Danielle. And subscribe to this channel because what happens next will deliver the most satisfying corporate justice you've ever seen.
But the tragedy had not stopped yet, because sometimes the most powerful moments of revelation come not from dramatic confrontations, but from understanding the personal journey that transforms victims into victors. What the board was about to learn about Danielle Porter's path to this moment would explain why Richard Carlisle's cruelty hadn't just insulted an employee, it had awakened something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The silence in the private dining room stretched like a held breath as Danielle settled into her chair at the head of the table, her presence transforming the entire dynamic of what Richard had assumed was his domain. But before addressing the business that had brought them together, she did something that revealed the depth of her strategic thinking. She began to tell a story that would recontextualize everything they thought they understood about power, privilege, and the price of underestimating people based on their circumstances. 25 years ago, Danielle began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned that the most powerful truths are delivered calmly rather than shouted. My mother, Patricia Porter, worked the night shift cleaning rooms at the original Carlisle Hotel. She was a single mother, recently divorced, trying to support a 7-year-old daughter on a housekeeper's salary that barely covered rent in the worst neighborhood we could find. The board members leaned forward, with the recognition that they were about to hear something significant. But Richard remained frozen in his chair, his mind racing through implications he was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just a business meeting anymore. This was the unveiling of a personal mission that had been decades in the making. One night, Danielle continued, her voice maintaining its steady cadence even as the emotional weight of the memory pressed against her professional composure. A guest claimed that my mother had stolen a towel from his room.
Not a valuable towel. Not even a particularly nice towel. Just a standard white hotel towel that had probably been replaced 100 times. But that guest was influential, connected, and convinced that the black woman cleaning his room must be a thief. The parallel to tonight's events was unmistakable, and several board members shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the pattern of assumption and prejudice that connected past and present. Richard's face had gone pale as he began to understand, and his treatment of Danielle wasn't just cruel, it was historically resonant in ways that made his actions far more significant than casual workplace discrimination. My mother was fired immediately, without investigation, without due process, without anyone bothering to check the security cameras that would have proven her innocence. Danielle's voice hardened slightly, revealing steel beneath the silk. The guest's word was enough. The word of a powerful white man against a black woman who cleaned toilets was never really a contest. But what transformed this story from tragedy to triumph was what happened next. The part that explained how a 7-year-old girl watching her mother's humiliation had eventually grown up to own the very company that had destroyed her family's economic security. That night, as my mother packed our belongings because we could no longer afford rent without her job, she made me promise something, Danielle said, her eyes finding Richard's across the table for the first time since entering the room. She made me promise that I would never let anyone make me feel small because of what I looked like, where I came from, or what job I was doing to survive. And more importantly, she made me promise that if I ever gained the power to change things, I would use that power to ensure no other child would watch their parents' dignity destroyed by people who confused wealth with worth.
The room was completely silent as the board processed the realization that they were witnessing something far more profound than a business meeting. They were watching the completion of a promise made by a dying woman to her daughter, a vow that had shaped decades of strategic planning, academic achievement, and corporate maneuvering. Danielle's path from that housing project apartment to the Wharton School of Business, from her first minimum wage job to building a consulting empire under a different name, from secretly acquiring shares in Carlisle Global Holdings to tonight's revelation, every step had been calculated to bring her to this moment where she could honor her mother's memory while dismantling the system that had destroyed Patricia Porter's dignity. I've spent the last 18 months conducting what the board approved as a comprehensive operational audit, Danielle explained, her voice returning to its professional tone even as the emotional foundation of her mission remained visible. But my real purpose was to understand whether Carlisle Global had evolved beyond the institutional cruelty that cost my mother her job and her health, or whether the same patterns of prejudice and abuse continued under new management. Richard's hands were trembling now as he realized that his entire tenure as CEO had been under surveillance by someone whose personal stake in the company's culture ran deeper than any professional obligation. Every decision he had made, every comment he had offered, every moment of casual cruelty had been documented by someone with both the authority and the motivation to ensure that justice was finally served. Tonight's events, Danielle said, her gaze finally settling on Richard with the weight of 25 years of preparation behind it, have provided the final evidence I needed to complete my mother's mission and begin the transformation that will honor her memory while ensuring that no employee of this company will ever again face the choice between dignity and employment. The revolution had begun, and Richard Carlisle was about to discover that some people don't just seek revenge, they build empires to deliver justice.
Right at that moment, As the board absorbed the full weight of Danielle's personal mission and Richard's role in completing it, the atmosphere in the private dining room shifted from corporate formality to something approaching a tribunal. What happened next would prove that sometimes justice arrives not through angry confrontation, but through the methodical presentation of evidence that leaves no room for denial or defense. Danielle reached into her briefcase with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment, her fingers finding a leather portfolio that contained 18 months of documentation, analysis, and recorded evidence that would transform Richard's evening of triumph into the most devastating professional destruction in corporate history. "Mr. Carlisle," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as she gestured for him to approach the head of the table, "would you please join me? I believe it's time for your performance review." The request was delivered with such calm politeness that it took several seconds for Richard to process the implications of what was happening. He was being summoned by someone he had publicly humiliated just hours earlier, called to account by a woman he had dismissed as a diversity hire, evaluated by the very person's dignity he had attempted to destroy in front of an audience. Richard's approach to the head of the table felt like a walk to his own execution, each step measured against the growing recognition that every cruel word, every racist comment, every moment of institutional abuse had been witnessed and documented by someone with both the power and the personal motivation to ensure that consequences were finally delivered. Over the past 18 months, Danielle began, opening the portfolio to reveal pages of transcripts, photographs, and digital recordings that represented a comprehensive indictment of Richard's leadership. "I have documented a pattern of discriminatory behavior, financial misconduct, and abuse of corporate resources that violates not only company policy, but federal civil rights law." The first piece of evidence was a recording from Richard's own office, captured during a meeting where he had discussed diversity hiring with his management team. His voice filled the dining room with devastating clarity. "We hire just enough of them to keep the lawyers happy, but I make sure they don't get promoted beyond where they can cause real damage. The customers expect a certain aesthetic, and I'm not running a social experiment." The board members' faces reflected horror as they realized they were hearing not just unprofessional commentary, but evidence of systematic discrimination that could result in federal investigations, massive lawsuits, and personal liability for everyone who had failed to address the hostile workplace culture Richard had created. But Danielle was just getting started. The next recording revealed Richard's instructions to management about performance evaluations. Give the diversity hires just enough criticism to justify keeping them in their place. Document every minor mistake, ignore their successes, and make sure they understand that their job security depends on staying grateful and invisible.
The evidence painted a picture of institutional cruelty that went far beyond tonight's public firing. It revealed a systematic campaign to ensure that employees like Danielle would never be able to advance, contribute, or challenge the corporate culture that treated them as decorative necessities rather than valuable human beings. Additionally, Danielle continued, her professional composure never wavering even as she presented evidence that would destroy Richard's career and reputation. "My audit revealed significant financial irregularities in the diversity and inclusion budget. Specifically, the misappropriation of federal tax incentives designated for minority business development. The financial crimes were detailed in spreadsheets that showed how Richard had diverted money intended for supplier diversity programs into personal entertainment expenses, how he had falsified reports to government agencies about the company's commitment to equal opportunity, and how he had used corporate resources to fund the very discrimination that those programs were designed to eliminate.
Richard stood frozen as 18 months of his private conversations, confidential decisions, and assumed to be secret misconduct was laid bare before the people whose respect and financial support his career depended upon. Every cruel joke, every discriminatory policy, every moment when he had confused his position with his worth was being presented as evidence of his unfitness to lead. "Based on this comprehensive evidence," Danielle said, her voice taking on the finality of a judge delivering a sentence, "I am exercising my authority as majority shareholder to terminate your employment effective immediately. Your corporate shares will be forfeited according to the conduct clauses in your employment agreement, and you will be barred from any future involvement with Carlisle Global Holdings or its subsidiary companies." The silence that followed was absolute, as Richard processed the reality that his career, his reputation, and his financial security were being systematically destroyed by the woman he had tried to humiliate. But Danielle wasn't finished delivering justice. She was about to announce his appointment of his replacement in a way that would complete the cosmic reversal of fortune that had been 25 years in the making. "Margaret," Danielle said, turning to the lead investor with the satisfaction of someone whose strategic planning was finally bearing fruit, "please contact security to escort Mr. Carlisle from the building. His access to all corporate systems and facilities is revoked immediately." Richard Carlisle, who had begun the evening as the powerful CEO conducting staff inspections, was ending it as an unemployed executive being removed by security while his former waitress claimed the throne he had assumed was permanently his. The hunter had become the hunted, and justice was being served with the precision that only comes from decades of patient preparation.
No one expected what happened in the weeks following Richard's termination, because sometimes the most profound transformations occur not through punishment, but through the systematic reconstruction of institutions that have been built on foundations of inequality and cruelty. What Danielle implemented across the Carlisle global empire would prove that real power isn't about revenge. It's about creating change so comprehensive that injustice becomes impossible. The announcement of the new corporate structure came during an all-hands meeting that packed Azure's main dining room with every employee, from executive assistants to kitchen staff, creating an unprecedented gathering where traditional hierarchies dissolved in favor of something revolutionary. Danielle stood before the assembled workforce wearing the same professional suit that had shocked the board meeting, but her message was directed toward people who had watched her serve tables just days earlier. "Effective immediately," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room with the authority of someone who had earned the right to reshape an entire industry. "Every service employee in the Carlisle Global System will receive a minimum wage increase of 40%, comprehensive health benefits, and profit-sharing opportunities that ensure your success is directly connected to the company's success." The gasps and applause that followed revealed how revolutionary these changes were in an industry that had traditionally treated service workers as disposable resources rather than valuable contributors. But Danielle was just beginning to outline transformations that would redefine what corporate responsibility looked like when backed by genuine commitment rather than public relations theater. Additionally, she continued, raising her hand to quiet the celebration, "we are implementing an anonymous reporting system for discrimination, harassment, or abuse of any kind. Every complaint will be investigated by an independent third party, and any manager found guilty of creating a hostile work environment will be terminated immediately, regardless of their revenue generation or corporate relationships."
The transformation extended beyond policy changes to fundamental shifts in corporate culture that would prevent future Richard Carlisles from poisoning workplace environments. Promotion criteria were revised to prioritize leadership qualities and employee development over personal connections or demographic assumptions. Management training became mandatory, focusing on unconscious bias, inclusive leadership, and the business case for diversity that extended beyond legal compliance. But perhaps the most emotionally powerful change was the establishment of the Patricia Porter Memorial Scholarship, a program that would provide full college funding for children of hospitality workers who demonstrated academic excellence and leadership potential. The scholarship wasn't just financial support, it was a promise that no child would be limited by their parents' job title or their family's economic circumstances. The impact on individual lives was immediate and profound. Maria, the assistant manager who had dismissed Danielle as a diversity hire, found herself participating in leadership development programs that forced her to confront her own biases while providing genuine opportunities for career advancement based on merit rather than politics. Her transformation from casual bigot to inclusive leader became a case study in how institutional change could reshape individual behavior when supported by genuine commitment from the top.
James, the server who had made cruel comments about Danielle's hiring, discovered that the new profit-sharing system meant his annual income had increased by over $15,000, fundamentally changing his family's economic security, while teaching him that inclusive policies benefited everyone rather than threatening anyone's opportunities. Most significantly, Jessica, the young hostess who had sensed something unusual about Danielle's calm response to Richard's cruelty, was selected for the company's new Management Fast Track program, her intuition and integrity marking her as someone who could help build the kind of workplace culture that Danielle envisioned. The industry impact extended far beyond Carlisle Global Holdings, as other hospitality companies scrambled to match the new standards, recognizing that talented employees would naturally gravitate toward employers who offered genuine respect, along with competitive compensation. Danielle's transformation of corporate culture had created a competitive advantage that forced entire industries to reconsider how they treated their workforce. But the most satisfying vindication came through the stories of change that emerged from employees who had witnessed Richard's public firing of Danielle. The same staff members who had laughed at her humiliation now served her with genuine respect that went far beyond fear or obligation. They had learned the difference between compliance and commitment, between following orders and embracing vision. The young hostess who had watched Danielle's composed exit approached her new chairwoman during a routine visit to the restaurant, her voice shaking with emotion as she offered an apology that captured the transformation occurring throughout the organization. "Ms. Porter," Jessica said, her eyes filled with tears of recognition and remorse, "I'm sorry for not speaking up that night. I knew what Mr. Carlisle was doing was wrong, but I was afraid for my job. I should have been braver." Danielle's response revealed the wisdom that had guided her 18-month investigation and the grace that would define her leadership going forward. "We all make choices based on the information and power we have available at the time," she said gently, her words offering forgiveness while acknowledging the complexity of institutional pressure. "What matters now is that we create an environment where speaking up for what is right is supported rather than punished, where courage is rewarded rather than feared." The conversation captured everything that Danielle had accomplished, not just the removal of one toxic leader, but the creation of a corporate culture where Jessica's natural instincts for justice could flourish rather than being suppressed by fear and economic necessity. As word of the transformation spread through industry publications and business schools, Danielle Porter became a case study in strategic leadership. proving that the most effective organizational change comes from understanding both the human cost of discrimination and the business benefits of inclusion. The woman who had been fired for not knowing her place had created a workplace where everyone's place was defined by their contributions rather than their circumstances, their character rather than their demographics, their potential rather than their past.
Right at that moment, 6 months after the boardroom revelation that had transformed Carlisle Global Holdings from a symbol of institutional cruelty into a beacon of inclusive excellence, Danielle Porter found herself returning to the place where her journey had reached its climax. What happened at Table 12 would complete the circle that had begun with her mother's humiliation 25 years earlier and proved that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in revenge, but in redemption. The evening light streaming through Azura's floor-to-ceiling windows cast the same golden glow that had illuminated Richard's arrogance and her own public firing, but the restaurant's atmosphere had been fundamentally transformed by changes that extended far beyond policy adjustments to touch the very soul of how human beings treated each other in spaces designed around service and hospitality. Danielle approached Table 12 wearing a simple black dress that echoed the server's uniform she had worn during her undercover investigation, but her presence now commanded the kind of respectful attention that comes from authentic authority rather than inherited privilege. The other diners in the restaurant recognized her not as the fired waitress from viral social media videos, but as the chairwoman whose leadership had redefined what corporate responsibility looked like when backed by genuine commitment to human dignity. The moment carried profound symbolism as Danielle settled into the same chair where she had been publicly humiliated by a man who had confused his position with his worth, his wealth with his character, his power with his right to dehumanize others. But tonight, the table served a different purpose. It was a place of reflection, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from promises kept and missions completed. The server who approached her table represented everything that Danielle's transformation had accomplished. Keisha was a young black woman whose journey from community college student working multiple jobs to Azure's evening manager had been made possible by the scholarship programs, mentorship opportunities, and genuine meritocracy that now defined Carlisle Global's approach to employee development. "Good evening, Chairwoman Porter," Keisha said, her greeting carrying genuine warmth rather than the fearful deference that had once characterized interactions between management and staff. "It's an honor to serve you tonight." But Danielle's response revealed the depth of the cultural transformation she had implemented throughout the organization. "The honor is mine, Keisha. Thank you for everything you do to make this place special. How is your business administration program progressing?" The personal knowledge and genuine interest in employee development reflected leadership that saw individual human beings rather than interchangeable resources, that understood success as collective achievement rather than zero-sum competition between those who served and those who were served. As Keisha brought her meal, Danielle reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of quiet triumph, the investigation that had revealed Richard's systematic discrimination, the boardroom confrontation that had exposed his criminal misconduct, the corporate transformation that had created opportunities for thousands of employees. All of it had been building towards something larger than personal vindication or professional success.
The most powerful vindication came in the form of a handwritten note that Keisha placed beside her plate, not unlike the warning that had once saved a federal agent's life or the promise that had launched a corporate revolution. But this note carried a different message, one that captured the essence of everything Danielle had accomplished through her patient, strategic pursuit of justice. "Miss Porter," the note read in Keisha's careful handwriting, "my little sister starts college next fall on the Patricia Porter Memorial Scholarship. She wants to study business so she can create companies that treat people the way you've taught us to treat each other. Thank you for showing us that power is only meaningful when it's used to lift others up."
The simple message carried the weight of generational change, proof that Danielle's mother's sacrifice had created ripples that would extend far beyond corporate policy into the lives of families who would now have opportunities that systemic discrimination had once made impossible. As Danielle finished her meal, she performed one final act that connected past and present while pointing toward a future where dignity would be the baseline rather than the exception. She left a $1,000 tip, not as a display of wealth, but as a gesture of respect for service workers whose contributions had too often been undervalued by people who forgot that every job performed with excellence deserved recognition. The final scene unfolded as Danielle walked toward the elevator that would take her to her office, her reflection visible in the polished surfaces that had once mirrored Richard's arrogance and her own quiet determination. But now those same mirrors reflected transformation, a woman who had honored her mother's memory by ensuring that no other child would watch their parents' dignity destroyed by people who confused position with power. The elevator doors opened to reveal the executive floor, where she would continue the work of building something that transcended corporate success to touch the realm of social justice. Her office walls displayed not just business awards and financial achievements, but photographs of scholarship recipients, letters from employees whose lives had been changed by inclusive policies, and testimonials from industry leaders who had adopted similar programs after witnessing the competitive advantages of treating people with genuine respect. As Danielle settled behind her desk, she understood that she had completed the mission that began with a 7-year-old girl's promise to her mother. The woman who had been told she didn't know her place had created a world where everyone's place was defined by their character rather than their circumstances, their contributions rather than their demographics, their dreams rather than other people's limitations. The text that appeared on screen as the camera pulled back to show the bustling restaurant below captured the essence of everything she had accomplished. Power isn't how loud you speak. It's how calmly you hold the room when truth walks in. She was never just a waitress. She was always the boss. And now, finally, everyone else knew it too.
Here's the truth that Danielle Porter taught us without ever raising her voice. In a world where people mistake uniforms for identity, the most transformative power belongs to those who understand that real strength doesn't demand recognition, it simply reshapes reality when justice requires action. Danielle's story reveals something profound about how we navigate systems designed to keep certain people invisible. Richard Carlisle made the fatal error that destroys so many in power. He confused his title with his worth, his wealth with his wisdom, his ability to humiliate others with actual authority. But Danielle understood something he never learned. The most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone assumes has no power. What makes her victory so powerful is that she didn't just destroy Richard. She used his cruelty as the foundation for building something beautiful. Her mother's humiliation became the blueprint for transformation that touched thousands of lives, proving that the most effective response to institutional hatred isn't revenge, but the creation of systems so inclusive that discrimination becomes impossible. The Patricia Porter Memorial Scholarship represents everything this story teaches us about legacy. Danielle didn't just honor her mother's memory with corporate success. She ensured other children would have opportunities her mother died believing were impossible. This is what authentic power looks like, not destroying enemies, but transforming systems while building pathways for others. Richard's downfall reminds us that institutional racism isn't just morally bankrupt, it's strategically stupid. When you systematically exclude brilliant minds, you create competitive disadvantages that eventually destroy you. Danielle's success was proof that inclusive leadership generates better results than exclusive arrogance. The most important lesson is that transformation is possible when guided by someone who remembers what injustice feels like and possesses the patience to build justice methodically. Danielle's quiet strength during months of humiliation wasn't submission, it was preparation. Her willingness to serve tables while owning the building wasn't humility, it was strategy.
Real power doesn't announce itself with volume or demand recognition through intimidation. It moves quietly, builds systematically, and reveals itself only when truth requires testimony. If this story reminded you that heroes often wear uniforms that hide their true identities, if it inspired you to treat everyone with dignity, hit that like button right now. Share your experiences with being underestimated or discovering hidden brilliance. I read every comment, and your stories inspire my content. Subscribe for more stories that prove character is destiny and that sometimes the person serving your table might actually own the entire building.